The rain didn't just fall that night, it attacked. A hard metallic curtain hammering the highway so violently it turned every headlight into a blurred smear and every second into a gamble. And Trevor Holden still heard the scream because some sounds cut through anything. Because panic has a frequency that slips past thunder and wind and common sense and lands straight in your bones. And when he saw the orange flicker ahead, he told himself it was a reflection, a trick, a roadside flare. Anything other than what his gut already knew. But then he crested the slight bend, and the truth opened like a wound. A sedan upside down, wheels still spinning in the air, flames crawling along the undercarriage like hungry fingers, smoke rolling low and black and thick enough to taste, and a half-circle of strangers standing back in the rain as if the storm itself had drawn a line they couldn't cross, phones raised, faces washed in firelight, the modern ritual of witness without touch, and someone shouted, "Don't." The tank could blow, and another voice said, "Sirens are coming." And Trevor's hand closed around the hot door handle anyway, not because he was brave in some clean, heroic way, but because his body moved before his mind could finish calculating the cost, and the metal fused to his palm in an instant, white-hot, skin sticking like melted wax, and when he yanked back a strip of himself came away with it, and the pain was so sharp it almost made him vomit. But he didn't let go, because inside that car an old woman hung limp from her seat belt. Head tilted at a wrong angle, blood running down her temple to the roof that was now the floor, and the dashboard was already catching, flames licking at wires and plastic, that sweet poisonous smell of burning upholstery mixing with gasoline and wet asphalt. And behind him the crowd swelled with a nervous murmur, the kind that wants someone else to be the first to die so nobody has to feel responsible. And Trevor heard himself breathing, ragged and loud. And for a split second he saw his daughter as clearly as if she stood beside him, 7 years old, asleep in their tiny apartment. Soft hair stuck to her forehead, stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, mouth slightly open the way it always was when she dreamed. And he thought, if I die here she will be alone, she will be swallowed by the system, she will be passed from office to office, caseworker to caseworker, and she can't even see the world she'll be forced to navigate without him. And he felt his feet hesitate. Felt that human instinct to protect the one life he had left to give her. And then another thought rose like a blade, clean and cruel, and impossible to ignore. What would I want if that was my daughter trapped behind glass, choking on smoke, dying while strangers stood in a half-circle filming her, waiting for professionals who might arrive too late? And something inside Trevor snapped into place. Not courage exactly, more like inevitability, like gravity. And he braced his foot against the twisted frame and pulled, teeth clenched, tendons in his forearms screaming, smoke curling around his face, rain turning to steam where it hit the flames. The door refusing him twice, metal locked in a stubborn, murderous grip, and on the third pull the hinge shrieked, a sound louder than the storm, and the door tore open with a ripping howl that made the crowd flinch backward, and smoke erupted out as if the car exhaled its last breath. And Trevor plunged his burned hand into it anyway, blind in that choking gray, feeling for the woman, finding her shoulder, her collar, the strap of the seat belt cutting across her chest like a noose. Fumbling for the buckle with fingers that didn't feel like fingers anymore, just throbbing heat, and his lungs seized and his eyes flooded, and he thought, "You have seconds, you have seconds." And then the buckle clicked, that small mechanical sound somehow louder than everything. And her body slumped into him, dead weight, and he wrapped an arm under her shoulders and dragged, slipping on wet pavement, stumbling backward with her until they collapsed together in the rain 10 feet from the fire. And he rolled her onto her back and pressed 2 fingers to her neck and found nothing, felt nothing, saw her lips gray, and for a terrifying moment the world narrowed to one simple, brutal fact. She is gone, and Trevor's mind tried to retreat, tried to say, "You did what you could, you have to go home to Sky," but his hands moved again, finding the center of her chest, and he began compressions, hard and fast, rain pounding his face, his burned palm screaming every time he pushed down, and he counted without meaning to, because counting is something you can hold on to when everything else is chaos. And somewhere behind him someone cried, and another voice shouted that the fire department was coming. And another voice said, "It's going to blow, it's going to blow." And then the woman coughed, a wet choking cough like the world was forcing itself back into her. And her chest rose in a weak stuttering gasp, and Trevor rolled her on her side as she vomited smoke and rainwater. And her eyes fluttered open, dazed, frightened, alive. And he leaned close and said, "You're okay. You're safe, help is coming," though he didn't know if any of those words were true. And right then the car behind them erupted. Not a small pop, but a sudden violent bloom of flame that lit the rain like daylight and shoved a wave of heat across the road. And the crowd screamed and scrambled backward. And Trevor felt his stomach drop, because if he'd waited even minutes, if he'd listened to the half-circle of fear, there would have been nothing to save. The sirens reached them after what felt like an hour but was only minutes, red lights flashing through sheets of rain, paramedics sliding on wet asphalt as they ran, and one knelt beside the woman while another grabbed Trevor's wrist and said, "Sir, I need to see your hand." And Trevor tried to pull away because all he could think about was Skye asleep alone. The apartment door, the locks, the way she trailed her hand along the wall when she moved, memorizing the world she couldn't see. And he said, "I'm fine. I have to go. My daughter is home, she's 7." And the paramedic's eyes softened and hardened at once, the way professionals look when they've learned empathy has to come with speed. And she cooled the burn with sterile water, the sting so sharp Trevor's vision went white, then smeared ointment across the blistered raw skin, wrapped gauze tight, and said, "You need a doctor within a day, that looks deep." And Trevor nodded because nodding was easier than admitting he didn't have time or money for a hospital bill. And a police officer took his statement while someone thrust a phone near his face asking for a comment and calling him a hero. But Trevor barely heard, because hero was a word for men who weren't scared, and he had been terrified. And he drove home with one hand on the wheel, the other poolsing in bandages, smoke still in his hair, rain turning the road into a black river. And when he finally reached the apartment and pushed inside, the first thing he did was stand in the doorway of Skye's room and listen to her breathing until he could convince his chest to loosen. 3 hours earlier, before the storm became a weapon, and before his name meant anything to anyone, Trevor Holden had been in that same tiny kitchen staring at bills spread across the counter like an accusation. Rent, electric, water, groceries. The numbers refusing to behave. And he'd done the math the way he always did. Again and again, hopping repetition would change reality. His paycheck from the elementary school janitor job already mostly gone, leaving a couple $100 to carry them through a month that didn't care about his effort. And he'd glanced at the envelope in the closet that held the specialist's paperwork, the thin white pages that carried both hope and punishment. Skye's blindness wasn't necessarily permanent. An innovative procedure could restore her vision with a success rate that felt like a miracle until you reached the price. And then it became a joke told by cruel people. And Trevor had been trying to figure out how to explain to a 7-year-old that new shoes would have to wait when Skye appeared in the doorway, small hand brushing the wall as she moved, not to steady herself exactly, but to map, to confirm the world was where she left it. And she asked for the soft pink sweater Grandma Jean had given her from church, and Trevor guided her to the drawer and placed it in her hands, and she smiled at the texture. And then, in that calm voice that always found him, she asked if he was okay, and Trevor had said he was tired because saying "I'm scared of failing you" would have shattered him. And Skye had teased him about being ancient at 33, and he'd forced a laugh because her giggle was one of the few things that made the weight feel lighter. And later he'd cooked mac and cheese again, because cheap food and routine were all he had to offer some days. And he'd watched Skye move through their small home with practiced confidence, each step memorized, each turn anticipated, because blindness had demanded she become brave in ways most adults never had to. And as he stirred the pot, he'd thought about guilt, the kind that lives in a man's throat, because the infection that stole Skye's vision had started as redness and irritation when she was a baby. And he and Caroline, young and broke without insurance, had waited, tried home remedies, told themselves it would pass. And by the time they scraped enough for a clinic visit, the damage was done. And Caroline had left not long after, And Trevor hated himself for the part of him that understood why she ran, hated himself more for the part that still missed her sometimes. And that night, after Skye was tucked in under her worn purple comforter, and Trevor read her the secret garden story with silly voices until she laughed, she told him that when she could see, the first thing she wanted to look at was his face, because people said she looked like him, and she wanted to know what that meant. And Trevor promised her one day, and Skye believed him with the simple faith of a child who has no reason to doubt the man who has made every sacrifice in silence. And when she fell asleep, he lay on the pull-out couch with springs digging into his back and listened to wind rattle the windows, and he remembered they were out of milk. And milk was one of the few things that made Skye feel independent in the morning. Cereal she could pour by counting. A small normal he couldn't bear to take away. So he took his keys and drove into a storm that the weather service warned might be the worst in years, and he told himself it would be 5 minutes there and back. And he didn't know he was driving toward the moment that would split his life into before and after. In the days that followed the rescue, Trevor's hand healed slowly, pink and tender and ugly under the bandages, each movement a reminder that pain is patient and always collects what it's owed. And he returned to mopping halls and emptying trash at Cedar Harbor Elementary because bills don't pause for heroism, because rent still wanted its number by the first, because groceries still cost what they cost. And he ignored reporters because attention doesn't pay for surgery, and being called a hero doesn't change the fact that he couldn't buy his daughter shoes without calculating what meal they would skip. And the little fundraising page he'd built for Skye's procedure stayed almost flat. A few sympathetic donations from strangers who meant well but had their own lives, their own bills, and Trevor kept depositing small amounts into the surgery fund anyway, as if stubbornness could outmuscle math. Until the afternoon in the empty hallway when his phone rang with an unknown Portland number, and he almost let it go to voicemail, because new numbers usually meant new problems. But he answered, and a calm voice said they were calling from Portland Children's Hospital to confirm Skye's surgery date. And Trevor's heart tried to stop, because he thought they must be calling about a mistake or a debt. But the woman on the line spoke as if everything was normal, as if the impossible was already scheduled in a computer system. And when Trevor stammered that he didn't have the money, couldn't possibly have the money, she replied that the full amount had been paid, every last dollar, and there was no cost to him. And Trevor gripped the mop handle and the hallway tilted and his burned hand let go, and the mop clattered to the floor because his brain refused to accept what his ears heard. And he asked who paid, and she said she couldn't share. The donor wished to remain anonymous. All he needed to do was bring Skye on the date. And Trevor wrote details across his scarred palm because he didn't trust his mind not to drop this miracle like everything else. And when the call ended, he slid down the wall and sobbed into his hands, the kind of crying that is half relief and half grief for every night he'd stared at the ceiling wondering if he would ever be enough. And when November came and Skye was admitted and the nurses wheeled her away, Trevor walked beside the gurney holding her small hand and whispering their ritual, "Love you to the moon and back, love you to the stars and further." And the doors closed and she was gone for hours that felt like a lifetime. And Trevor sat in the waiting room staring at a clock that moved like it hated him, thinking about the anonymous donor, thinking about the fire, thinking about the faces in the rain holding phones instead of hands. And when Dr. Martinez emerged with a tired smile and said the procedure went perfectly, better than they could have hoped, that they repaired both optic nerves and restored retinal tissue, that Skye could have full vision once swelling dropped, Trevor couldn't make his mouth work. And when Skye woke in recovery with bandages over her eyes, she asked if it worked and asked what he looked like. And he described his too long brown hair and green eyes and crooked nose and need to shave. And she said he sounded perfect. And for 5 days, Trevor lived on cafeteria coffee and prayer until the bandage removal. And when the last layer came away and Skye slowly opened her eyes, her blue irises blinking into a dimmed room like dawn, her gaze found his face and held it, steady, learning, and she whispered, "Daddy." And then she said his hair was brown and his eyes were green like spring grass. And she reached up to touch a tear on his cheek and announced, like a scientist making a discovery, that he was crying, and Trevor laughed and cried harder, and Sky grinned and told him again that he needed to shave. And in that moment the world felt so huge it could swallow them whole. And yet they were safe inside it because she could see. Back home, Sky moved through their apartment as if it were a brand new planet, noticing how small it was without being sad about it, marveling at the colors of cereal boxes, the way sunlight looked like gold on cheap linoleum, the ocean glimpsed through gaps between buildings. And she pressed her face to the car window on the drive and kept whispering, "It's so big. Everything is so big." And Trevor tried to convince himself that the anonymous donor didn't matter anymore because the miracle had happened. But the question remained like an itch under the skin. Who would pay $95,000 for a janitor's child and refuse to take credit? And 3 weeks later, when a knock came at the door, Trevor opened it expecting a neighbor and found an elderly woman with silver hair styled perfectly, elegant coat beaded with rain, eyes that made his stomach drop because he recognized them from the worst night of his life. And she introduced herself as Lauren Rhodes, and behind her stood a man in an expensive suit with a leather briefcase. And Trevor's mouth went dry as he realized the woman he pulled from the burning car had come to his home, to his small, cramped life, and she asked to come in. And Trevor stepped aside, embarrassed by worn furniture and poverty exposed in every corner. But Lauren's gaze held curiosity without judgment as she noticed the braille materials and audiobooks and little adaptations that had made this place safe for a blind child. And Sky called from the bedroom asking who it was. And when she came out, bright-eyed and curious, Lauren's face softened in a way money couldn't buy. And Sky proudly announced she'd had surgery and a nice person paid, and her daddy said they must be an angel. And Lauren's eyes filled, and Trevor understood the answer with a heaviness that was almost too much to carry. And he said, "It was you." And Lauren nodded as if confession was the only honest thing left. And she said she'd been conscious long enough in the car to see the crowd watching her die, and then to see him run toward her anyway. And when she learned about his daughter, about the surgery, about his saving, she knew what she had to do, because gratitude that large doesn't fit in words. And then her lawyer opened the briefcase and laid out documents that made Trevor's hands tremble. A trust for Sky's education through whatever degree she desired, money for a home, comprehensive health insurance, and a job offer to run a foundation Lauren was establishing in Trevor's name to help families like his, because she had built an empire, and in the moment she thought she would die, she didn't think about any of it. She thought about how alone she was, how wealth without love is just a pile of numbers, and how no one in that half circle would have truly mourned her beyond the shock of a viral clip. And then he, a stranger with nothing, had given her something priceless, proof that goodness still existed in a world that often chooses distance. And she told him she couldn't repay life, but she could honor it by turning his one act into hundreds of second chances for other children. And Trevor stood there shaking, trying to speak through a throat clogged with emotion, until Sky walked up and took Lauren's hand and thanked her plainly for helping her daddy and letting her see. And then, with the fearless logic of children, she asked if she could call her Grandma Lauren, and Lauren's composure broke, tears spilling as she hugged Sky and said she would be honored. And in that cramped apartment something shifted, the air changing, as if a new kind of family had stepped into existence. The news broke days later, because money that moves that fast leaves trails journalists love, and because a foundation tied to a dramatic roadside rescue makes a neat headline. And suddenly Trevor Holden couldn't walk down a street without someone recognizing him, pointing, whispering, calling him the man who ran into fire. And at first the attention felt wrong, like wearing someone else's skin. But then Trevor learned to redirect it, because the Holden Foundation's work needed eyes, needed stories, needed people to believe kindness could be organized and scaled. And when the ribbon cutting came months later, modest and local, Lauren stood beside him smiling. And Sky, now 8 and bright and thriving, became the foundation's beating heart, telling anyone who would listen that her dad saved Grandma Lauren and Grandma Lauren saved them. and now they were going to save other kids too. And Trevor sat with desperate parents in waiting rooms and listened to the kind of fear that empties a person. And he saw himself in them, and he said the words he once needed to hear. "You're not alone. We're going to try." And one by one, the foundation funded transplants and cancer treatments and surgeries and medications and travel and rent so parents didn't have to choose between a cure and a roof. And Sky watched it all with eyes that still carried wonder. And Lauren visited their new home with a yard where Sky ran with a puppy and laughed until she hiccuped. And on quiet evenings, Lauren asked Trevor why he ran toward the flames when everyone else didn't. And Trevor would admit the truth every time, that he thought about his daughter, about what he would want if she was the one dying behind glass. And then he couldn't not move. And Lauren would squeeze his scarred hand and tell him that was rarer than he knew, not because most people are evil, but because fear makes excuses sound like wisdom. And years later, when Cedar Harbor erected a small bronze plaque at the accident site, Trevor brought Sky, now taller, older, reading the inscription herself. And she said it was missing the most important part, the part where they became a family. And Lauren, moving slower now but still sharp, agreed that heroism without love is only half the story. And they walked away hand in hand, arguing about cookies and ice cream, and whether the dog should get a bite. And the plaque gleamed behind them in the sun. But the real legacy wasn't medal or headlines or viral clips. It was a child who could see the sky and the ocean and the whole big world she once only imagined. It was a father who learned that the hardest choices become the moments that remake your life. It was a woman who discovered that wealth is meaningless without someone to share it with. And it was a family built not by blood but by courage and gratitude and the simple decision to help when it would have been easier to watch. And if you felt something in your chest while hearing this, if it made you remember the version of yourself that still believes goodness matters, don't let the story end in your ears. Share it. Pass it on. Because sometimes sharing hope is the quiet kind of rescue the world needs most.